Yes, sure. Okay. This is my last article. Thank you.
Okay, good afternoon and welcome to yet another occasional lecture from the Department of Academic Research and Publications of the Institute of Ismaili Studies here in London. And greetings also to those who are connecting to the webcast. We have, I think, more than 80 people who have registered, so that's more people in the webcast than in the room. But anyway, so it's a pleasure to introduce to you today our speaker, Dr. Fatimid Rejection. He combines two main interests in him. The interest in various communities and doctrines and movements within the Shia, as well as an interest in Neoplatonic philosophy. In fact, his BA was in Arabic in al-Kashf, which is the National Institute for Oriental Languages and Civilizations in Paris, and then he went on to do two masters, one in philosophy, and he studied the philosophy of Proclus, the Neoplatonist philosopher, with a special interest on his religious thought, and more specifically his doctrine of the imagination. He tells me that he has received some influence from Henri Corbin in this. But he also did concurrently an MA in Islamic Studies from the École Pratique des Hautes Études, where he then moved on to do his PhD under the supervision of Professors Daniel Desmet and Muhammad Ali Amir Moazi, good old friends and professors of ours. His dissertation consisted, which he finished and defended last year, consisted of an annotated French translation of Jaʿfar ibn Mansūr al-Yaman's Kitāb al-Kashf, and this will be the topic of the lecture today. I think he will speak for about 30 to 35 minutes, and then we will have a chance for questions. So please welcome Dr. Fatimid Rejection.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. I would like to begin by expressing all my gratitude to the Institute of Ismaili Studies for our past collaborations, as well as for the opportunity it has given me today to present my research. So I will be speaking about Kitāb al-Kashf, which is a collection of 6 treatises transmitted by the Ismaili tradition. It is attributed to Jaʿfar ibn Mansūr al-Yaman, who died sometime in the middle of the 10th century. However, I will not discuss the attribution of the text, as we lack elements of comparison to determine if Jaʿfar was indeed the author of this work or not. I will therefore concentrate on the book and its contents, delaying the difficult matter of the attribution to a time when Jaʿfar's other works have been edited and examined. As Wilfred Madelung's previous research has shown, and as I believe I have confirmed in my own doctoral dissertation, the Kitāb al-Kashf was probably composed in the earliest period of the Fatimid rule, that is, in the beginning of the 10th century. However, this date of composition doesn't apply to all the elements in the book. Many passages are actually older and must be dated from the Ismaili pre-Fatimid period, if not earlier, before the existence of Ismailism as a distinct community. Added to the extreme allusiveness of the text, the multiple layers make the Kitāb al-Kashf very difficult to analyze. The positive historical clues that can help propose a datation of the work are very scant. There are only 2 of them in the whole collection. One is the mention of Muhammad bin Ahmad, who was the predecessor of the first Fatimid Caliph Abdullah al-Mahdi at the head of the Dawah. And the other is the mention of the second Fatimid Caliph, al-Qa'im bi Amrillah. The mention of Muhammad bin Ahmad appears in an important passage of the 5th treatise. It is said there that Muhammad bin Ahmad presented himself as the representative of the Imam, that is to say as his hujjah or proof, while in fact he was himself the Imam. His actual position was only known by a few initiates of the Dawah. As Professor Madlung has shown, this passage must have been written before the reign of Al-Mu'izz, the 4th Fatimid Caliph, as the lineage of the Imams from Muhammad bin Ismail to Abdullah al-Mahdi was then reformed, and Muhammad bin Ahmad replaced by his brother, al-Hussein. So this passage from the Kitāb al-Kashf echoes Abdullah al-Mahdi's declarations in a letter preserved to us in another work of Jaʿfar ibn Mansūr al-Yaman. Therefore, we can deduce from this an approximate datation for the final composition of the Kitāb al-Kashf, which is sometime during Abdullah al-Mahdi's reign, or in the beginning of al-Qa'im's reign, his successor. Apart from this, the book contains no explicit reference to historical events. However, to these 2 elements, mentions of Muhammad bin Ahmad and al-Qa'im, we can add several interpretations of Quranic verses attributed to a certain al-Hakim, the sage, which is most probably Muhammad bin Ahmad's nickname. So this shows that the Kitāb al-Kashf relies on pre-Fatimid material, even though its final composition must be dated from the early Fatimid period. When examining the contents of the book, it appears that this pre-Fatimid material is of various origins. All Shi'i, of course, but from different Shi'i trends. First, we find general Shi'i ideas concerning the succession of Muhammad, the usurpation of the rule and the religious authority, the Amr, as classical Shi'i literature names it. Secondly, we find some elementary Ismaili doctrines, such as the 7 Nutaqa, the messengers sent to humanity with a new religion and a new Sharia, or the messianic expectations. In between those 2 orientations, there is a third trend which corresponds to what is generally considered as extremist Shi'ism, or exaggerating Shi'ism, that is to say, ghuluww. There are indeed many parallels between the Kitāb al-Kashf and some aspects of the ghulāt literature that have reached us, as either directly or through Nusayrī exposés, because the Nusayrī traditions has transmitted a lot of ghulāt doctrines and elements. The Kitāb al-Kashf therefore presents 2 major interests. First, it is a testimony of the Shi'i doctrines that circulated before their institutionalization, either through 12-er Shi'i orthodoxy or Ismaili orthodoxy, as formed under the Fatimid rule. And secondly, it is the testimony of the doctrine adopted by Ismailis during the first years of the Fatimid period. So this lecture will concentrate on this second point. I will however begin with a few words about the ghulāt and the general dialectic between heterodoxy and orthodoxy. It is a general truth that orthodoxies always derive from heterodoxies and not the other way around. This was the case in Christianity, where the councils were chronologically posterior to the so-called heresies. This was also the case in Islam in general, and in Shi'ism in particular. As Heinz Halm puts it, just as the theology of the Christian church appeared through struggle against the old gnosis, Imamate orthodoxy was formed only against the backdrop of the ghulāt teachings, in their taking into account and in the confrontation with them. He adds that before the occultation of the 12th Imam in 874, and especially in the Iraq, what was labeled as ghuluww by heresiologists was actually the absolute form of Shiism. The construction of 12er Shi'i orthodoxy is of interest to my subject, as a similar process occurred under the Fatimids from the very beginning of their rule, as I will try to demonstrate. The great turning point of 12er Shi'ism took place in the second half of the 10th century. Since the first occultation in 874, after then the occultation of the 12th Imam, the community was in the grip of various debates between rationalists and esotericists, between partisans of the use of reason and partisans of the hadith of the Imams. After the great occultation in 941 and the coming to power of the Buyid viziers in Baghdad in 945, the Shi'i theology experiences a process of theological rationalization. Thus, several doctrines and traditions perceived as irrational or exaggerating are censored. As Professor Amir Moizi has shown in his work, the most esoteric hadiths, especially those who attribute supernatural powers to the Imams, are gradually removed from the great Shi'i collections of hadith. Being close to the Sunni power, the great Shi'i families tended to evacuate the aspects of their religion that were most likely to shock the Sunni majority, such as the doctrine of the falsified Quran or the vilification of the companions. This process of moderation, due to access to political power, is something we can also observe in the early Fatimid period, as the study of the Kitāb al-Kashf shows. It is only through political power that an orthodoxy can establish itself, and orthodoxy is composed by rejection of certain aspects that are thenceforth considered as heretic. Therefore, we must always keep in mind when using this concept of ghuluww that it is polemical and not entirely reliable. Furthermore, some ghuluww concepts, such as the Raj'a, the idea that the Mahdi is hidden and will return at the end of times, were traditionally considered as a typical ghulāt doctrine, was finally adopted by the 12er Shi'i orthodoxy. And as Professor Amir Moizi has shown in his research, the great Shi'i collections of hadith are full with allusions to doctrines otherwise considered as ghuluww by heresiologists. The term ghuluww comes from two Quranic verses that both say, don't exaggerate in your religion. لا تغلوا في دينكم. In the Quran, this recommendation is for the people of the book, and in the verse 171, it applies more specifically to the exaggeration of Jesus' status according to Christian theology. The Islamic tradition will, however, mostly apply these verses to the extremist Shi'is and to some specific doctrines. Among these doctrines are the ideas of reincarnation and antinomianism. Sorry. I now turn to the texts that are at your disposal and that I have chosen to illustrate how the Kitāb al-Kashf draws on the vocabulary and doctrines of ghuluww while adapting this earlier data to the needs of the young Fatimid Caliphate. So the first extract is from the first treatise of the Kitāb al-Kashf. This treatise is the most clearly influenced by ghulāt doctrines and vocabulary. However, several ahadith quoted in the treatise are followed by commentaries that are most likely of Fatimid origin. For example, a mystical sermon attributed to Ali ibn Abi Talib, is followed by a Fatimid gloss explaining that God's order is continuous, Amr Allah muttasil, which must be understood as a support to the Fatimid Imam's claim to be a descendant of Ali in the genealogical, political and spiritual senses altogether. So our first passage is one of these Fatimid glosses. It comes after a hadith attributed to Jaʿfar al-Sadiq, the sixth Imam, in which he describes an ecstatic vision of his, where he contemplated 10 domes of light, ghuluww min nur. These 10 domes are then identified to the 7 nutaqa, so the messengers who bring a new religious law, and three other esoteric ranks: the measurer, al-Kali, the guardian, Raqib, and the gate, Bab, al-Bab. Note that none of these ranks are specifically Ismaili. As a matter of fact, 2 of them, the Raqib and the Kali, don't usually appear in Ismaili texts. The Kali seems to appear nowhere except for the work of al-Tabarani, who is a Nusayrī author from the 11th century. This is therefore an indication of the provenance of this hadith, that the Kitāb al-Kashf unfortunately transmits in a corrupted version. So the provenance is namely a Shia source common to both Nusayris and early Ismailis. Then comes our passage. By domes, we must understand the veil of God's hidden knowledge. He named them so, but this is not in the sense that the Nazarenes mean when they say that the body of Jesus is a form, haikal, in which the Creator descended on earth, walking among His servants. Exalted be God far beyond that. The declarations of the exaggerators, the ghulāt, among the Muslims about the Imam and messengers are similar to this. They also say that their bodies are figures in which the Creator hides Himself when He descends to earth, so that they are His domes, that is to say, places that contain Him on His earth. He would thus be present in the body of each of them in His time. Glorified and exalted be God beyond what the iniquitous say. He forbade this in His book by saying, "People of the book, do not exaggerate about your religion and say about God only the truth." So this rejection of both the Christian theology and the ghulāt doctrines about the prophets and imams can be found in other Ismaili works, such as the Sara'ir al-Nutaqa by Jaʿfar ibn Mansūr al-Yaman, and in al-Mu'ayyad fi ad-Din al-Shirazi works, his Majalis, al-Mu'ayyad, who is a Fatimid author from the 11th century. The doctrine that is rejected here is to be explained by the idea that the prophets and imams are merely envelopes to a unique principle. This principle, or divine light, transmigrating from a body to another in each era. This idea that God or a divine entity emanated from Him, this idea that God takes several veils or forms, hayakil, through time, is actually the doctrine of tanasukh, one of the great doctrines attributed to the ghulāt. As we see here, the author of the gloss is dissociating from this, which corresponds to the Fatimid official theology as we know it from later sources. However, in another passage of the Kitāb al-Kashf, which is the second extract from the 5th treatise, we can find the word haikal that appears again. So only this time it is not to be refuted but to be adopted. God appears to His friends, awliya, in 70 forms, haikal. So this shows that the Kitāb al-Kashf is not a coherent collection written by only one author. It is a composition of fragments of various origins, assembled and edited by a later author from the early Fatimid period. It is full with contradiction of this kind. Although ghuluww is here explicitly rejected, or implicitly in other passages, the characteristic doctrines and vocabulary of the ghulāt appear everywhere in the text. Another example of this ghulāt presence is the concept of transmigration, or metamorphosis into inferior forms of being, as a punishment for disbelief. Masakh. This idea appears in the Quran, but it hasn't been an important feature of Sunni theology. Rather, it has received special attention in Shi'i literature. We find it in the 12 Shi'i hadith collection, but mostly it was one of the key concepts of the ghulāt. The presence of this concept in the Kitāb al-Kashf is an indication of its ghulāt origins, especially because it appears under the uncommon form musukhiyya instead of masakh, which echoes a great ghulāt book, the Kitāb al-Hafth wal-Azillah, attributed to Jaʿfar al-Sadiq's disciple, Mufaddal al-Ju'fi. However, if the Kitāb al-Kashf is obviously built on ghulāt material, it also bears the marks of a work of reinterpretation, and its approach of the musukhiyya is one of the examples of this book's general tendency to soften and refine ideas of ghulāt origin. Indeed, every time the Kitāb al-Kashf deals with the musukhiyya, it opts for a metaphorical approach of the concept, as we will now see. So this is our fourth extract. About the word of God, say, be stone or iron or any other substance you think hard to bring to life. The sage says that it is addressed to Abu al-Fasil and Zufar, which are surnames of Abu Bakr and Omar, the first two Muslim caliphs. About them, God said to his messenger, said, be stone or iron, that is to say, if you do not obey the command of God to trust the master of the exegesis, the Imam, and to take the exegetical knowledge from him, then be stone and iron, solid. You will not understand any science. None of your effort and actions will be accepted by God. Indeed, stone and iron are solid matter that understand no science and do not act because they have no life as found in animals. So here the musukhiyya isn't explicitly mentioned. However, according to the heresiologist al-Qummi, the Quranic verse that is quoted here was used by the ghulāt sect, the Mukhammisa, or Pentadists, who apparently had ties with another sect called the Khattabiyya. So this sect used this Quranic verse to support its doctrine of tanasukh. The Mukhammisa believed that the souls of their enemies would take different forms, human and non-human, until they have been reincarnated in all animals, all mobile and motionless beings, including stars and planets. They would then end up as solid matter, stone, earth, or iron, as an eschatological punishment. This report by al-Qummi, who is a 12 Shi'i heresiologist, is confirmed by ghulāt texts such as the Kitāb al-Hafth wal-Azillah, which indeed uses this verse to support transformation into minerals. It is interesting to see how the Kitāb al-Kashf resorts to this verse and propose a metaphorical interpretation. Stone and iron shouldn't be taken in a literal sense, but according to their quality of non-living, inert matter. Life being a symbol of the spiritual life, that is to say the ilm al-batin, the esoteric knowledge, those who are deprived from this knowledge are deprived from real life, and therefore they are like solid matters, bodies without souls. Unbelievers do not become literally stone or iron, they become similar to them. In the second extract, what's interesting is the persistence of an expression that is clearly referring to the classical, that is to say literal conception of musukhiyya. About Abu Bakr's punishment, the Kitāb al-Kashf says, it quotes first Quranic verse that says, "For him there is disgrace in this worldly life." And the Kitāb al-Kashf goes on and says, by this he means his transformation into a variety of figures and forms. وَيُمْسَخْ فِيهِ مِنْ اخْتِلَافِ الصُّوَرِ وَالْهَيَاكِلِ. Again we have this word hayakil, haykal. This metamorphosis, masakh, consists in a transfer, sorry for the mistake in the copy I sent, in a transfer for a class into another. He was indeed counted among the Muslims and companions of the Messenger of God, but he then left this class, passing from the class of the ignorant, to the class of the ignorant, who brought him from the ranks of science to the stratum of denial, from the grades of obedience and faith to the class of associators, because he associated to the order of God his personal choice. So such is the meaning of any allusion to metamorphosis. It is the passage from this praiseworthy state to those blameworthy states. So here we have this expression وَيُمْسَخْ فِيهِ مِنْ اخْتِلَافِ الصُّوَرِ وَالْهَيَاكِلِ, which clearly refers to this classical conception of musukhiyah. But even though this expression is preserved, it is immediately followed by an interpretation that aims to neutralize the literality of the text and tries to pull it towards a metaphorical comprehension. This passage is quite characteristic of the way the Kitāb al-Kashf uses ancient material and adapts it, though approximately, to new doctrinal orientations. As we see here, this adaptation is sometimes poorly convincing. So my third extract from the second part, humans are analogous to people of truth who know guidance, love and follow it, who know error, loathe it and avoid it. They are favored with the knowledge that enables them to distinguish true from false and bad from good. But people of falsehood are analogous to dogs and pigs that do not distinguish between true and false, nor bad and good. They do not try to guide themselves. They do not follow the right direction. They feed on what is ignoble, and their actions are turpitude. Whoever turns away from the truth towards falsehood does it in vain, because by turning his heels, he metaphorically leaves the status of humanity to join that of dogs and pigs. This is the meaning of metamorphosis. So what's interesting here is the explicit, it's the explicit idea that mesukhiyah is a metaphor by the expression fi al-mathal. The extract relies on the same analogy we met before between spiritual death and soul matters, except this time unbelievers and ignorance are compared to animals. So from this we can conclude that the Fatimid author of the Kitāb al-Kashf has systematically chosen to give a metaphorical interpretation of transformation into inferior forms, making it a symbol rather than a physical event. The enemies of the Dawah are like animals because they have no knowledge, that is to say esoteric knowledge. They are like solid matter because they have no spiritual knowledge, which is the life of the intellect, just as the soul is the life of the body. This evolution of the literal conception of the musukhiyah towards a more spiritual approach is, in my view, that of Ismailism itself in comparison to its ghulāt roots. I now come to the last aspects of the Fatimid Ismaili dialogue with ghuluww as it appears in the Kitāb al-Kashf. Antinomianism can be a natural tendency of esotericism. From the moment a doctrine values an esoteric meaning of the religious duty, there is a temptation to consider that the knowledge of this meaning renders the external rights obsolete. The knowledge of the batin makes the zahir useless. As the Kitāb al-Hafth wal-Uzullah, this great ghulāt book that I mentioned, puts it, whoever knows this esoteric is exempt from the fulfillment of the exoteric. سقط عنه عمل الظاهر. In the ghulāt Shiism, esotericism is often a matter of individualities, أشخاص or رجال. According to a famous Shia hadith, religion is knowledge of individuals. الدين معرفة الرجال. Therefore, the gnosis consists in seeking the walaya of the imam and disavowing his enemies. This knowledge of the individuals as a core of religion is hand in hand with allegoric interpretations of religious prescriptions, which brings us to the problem of antinomianism. Antinomianism is also linked to messianic expectations. There was a or maintain it. The first Fatimid Caliph who appeared as the Mahdi had some enthusiastic followers who considered that all the religious prescriptions of the Sharia were lifted as the Mahdi had appeared. According to the chronicler Ibn Idari, al-Mahdi had several of his own missionaries executed after they had been accused of antinomian practices, such as drinking alcohol and eating pork during Ramadan moreover. One of them, a certain al-Balawi, had also been praying in the direction where al-Mahdi was staying, because the Qibla, in the esoteric sense, is no other than the Imam. Later, in 912, 1 year after the missionary Abu Abdullah al-Shi'i, who conquered North Africa on behalf of the Ismaili Dawah. So 1 year after he was executed for plotting against Abdullah al-Mahdi, a revolt rose among some of the Kutama Berbers, who were the army of the Fatimid Caliphate. This revolt was led by a certain Kadu bin Mu'arik al-Mawatri, who claimed to be a prophet and a Mahdi. According to Qadi al-Nu'man, he established a new religion and authorized licentious acts. It was under these circumstances that Al-Qa'im bi Amrillah was officially appointed as Abdullah al-Mahdi's successor and assigned to break the rebellion, which he did. So it is possible that the two passages that we will now see and that reject antinomianism were echoing these antinomian temptations among members of the Dawah. So the first of these two passages is, however, problematic, as it appears in a peculiar paragraph whose style and vocabulary is absolutely unique in the collection. And it mentions concepts that are totally absent of the rest of the Kitāb al-Kashf and that are of philosophical provenance. It is possible that this paragraph was added further during the process of transmission of the text. Nevertheless, it still illustrates the official Fatimid doctrine. The exoteric and esoteric aspects of God's religion are analogous to knowledge and action. Indeed, action is analogous to the body and the spirit to knowledge. Well, as long as spirit and body coexist, knowledge and action are due together. So this will of maintaining the batin and the zahir together, as long as spirit and body coexist, represent the official orientation of Fatimid thought. In another passage that I haven't given you, the Kitāb al-Kashf says that, mentions the true religion in which there is no exaggeration nor reduction. La ghuluww wa la taqsir. This is the median way that the Fatimids chose The second passage is from a lengthy exegesis of verse 197, which deals with obscenity, depravity, and dispute, from which the pilgrim must abstain. Sorry. This exegesis is interesting because it seems to be attributed to the sage, and therefore to be dated from the pre-Fatimid period. Remind that the sage is Muhammad bin Ahmad, so the last hidden imam of the Ismaili da'wah before Abdullah al-Mahdi's appearance. According to this sage, al-Hakim, obscenity is to divulge the secret of Muhammad's family. Depravity is to gossip about another believer. Of course, here the believers, mu'mineen, are exclusively members of the da'wah, not Muslims in general. As for disputes, it is unnecessary polemics between members of the da'wah. So as we can see, this verse was initially used during the pre-Fatimid period for the sake, in order to organize the da'wah and to transmit instructions to the missionaries. However, the text as it have reached us is more complicated than that. Because the part that deals with depravity is quite unclear, as other interpretations were added to the one attributed to al-Hakim. So these other interpretations are likely to have been inserted there during the edition of the Kitāb al-Kashf, that is to say the early Fatimid period. So I will now read a part of the text. Depravity is fornication. Al-fusuq huwa zina. Depravity is not licit to the believer. Whoever indulges in depravity becomes an iblis who despairs, ablasa, from mercy. He is expelled through the door of the wall whose interior is mercy and whose exterior is torment. So I skip a few lines. The believer must be virtuous, pure and graceful. He must avoid fornication and stay away from it at risk of destroying his soul. Again, I skip a few lines. He who deserts exoteric duties will suffer torment and will not benefit from esoteric knowledge. Just as whoever sticks to the exoteric without the esoteric will suffer torment, because he does not bind what God has commanded to bind to his continuous rope and his solid handhold. He does not bind spirit and body, knowledge and action. He does not follow the legatee after the messenger, nor the exegesis after the revelation. Whoever abandons the exoteric laws or clings to the exoteric and abandons the exoteric must suffer torment. This outside torment corresponds to both situations. So the text begins with a literal interpretation of depravity. It is fornication in the common sense. There is no esoteric meaning here. This sentence is then followed by a commentary of verse 57:13, which mentions a wall whose interior is mercy and whose exterior is torment. Unsurprisingly, the interior of the wall is identified with esoteric science dispensed by the Imam, while the exterior of the wall, and thus the torment, correspond to the people of the exoteric, as well as those among the believers who are reductionists. This is the point that is interesting here. Who are those reductionist believers? As I have recalled, believers in this context is a technical term for members of the da'wah. As for the taqsir, it is a designation of their adversaries by the groups who were labeled as ghulāt. Just as, according to their opponents, the ghulāt exaggerated about the status of the imams, their supernatural powers, etc., the muqassira and those who reduce the powers of the imam. They can also be those who refused Ali's mission after the Prophet Muhammad. That is to say, those who refused the idea that the revelation, Tanzil, was to be accomplished through through ta'wil. Having that in mind, it seems odd that the Muqassira are within the Dawah. So the text is not very clear, but what we grasp here is that the text, that it is giving a new and original meaning to taqsir. Taqsir is to desert exoteric duties and indulge in depravity and fornication, and therefore it deserves torment, just as the refusal of the Imam's esoteric knowledge deserved it. Surprisingly, taqsir here is almost synonymous to ghuluww in its usual meaning. What is described here is an antinomian attitude consisting in abandoning religious duties when reaching their inner and esoteric meaning. When reaching their inner and esoteric meaning. This would usually be labeled as typical ghuluww. Labeling it taqsir is very unusual. Further in the same fifth treatise, this original definition of taqsir is confirmed. The author defines the abandonment of deeds and efforts as a form of taqsir. So although this passage is somehow obscure, it is subverting the notion of taqsir by diverting it from the meaning it had in ghulāt circles and giving it a meaning that corresponds to a moderate Shiism. The taqsir then, is the reduction, the taqsir here, is the reductionism as to the esoteric works or deeds, and not a reduction of the Imam's powers or the importance of esoteric knowledge. So this moderation of the doctrine, this affirmation of the necessity of exotericism as well as esotericism, is typical of the moderate Fatimid Shiism. It illustrates how, as soon as the caliphate begins to consolidate and a dynastic succession is contemplated, Abdullah al-Mahdi reforms his eschatological status to institute a lasting political imamate. The Kitāb al-Kashf is a valuable testimony not only for Shiism in general, of ghulāt Shiism and Ismailism in particular, not only of the way Ismailism engages in a reformation of its doctrine under the Fatimid rule, but also of the way a religious tradition is created, building on an ancient reserve of doctrines and texts through a process of selection, elimination, and reinterpretation of ancient data. What makes the great value of the Kitāb al-Kashf is precisely its incoherent, disorganized aspect, as it is the sign that this collection is the actual theater of a doctrinal and political process that constituted Ismailism as a distinct community. Thank you for your attention.
Right, time for questions. Yeah, if you can wait for the microphone, please.
Thank you very much for the presentation. It's really interesting, the idea that you said at the beginning that orthodoxy comes after heterodoxy. That was new for me. It was really interesting. So, according to what criteria did you say, for example, that these ideas are ghuluww? Because that means that people after that, after al-Kashf, after the book, they said in the Fatimid literature, for example, they said that he is...
No, I called it ghuluww because before the appearance of the Ismaili Dawah, there had already been debates among the Imami Shi'is, and there had already been heresiological works trying to determine, it is all the Firaq literature that classifies the different Shi'i groups according to their beliefs. And in these kind of books were actually used to establish an Imami 12er orthodoxy and to disavow all the beliefs that were held by these groups described in those books. So the typical doctrines that were considered as ghuluww by these heresiologists were reincarnation and supernatural power of the imams and antinomian tendencies. But this was well before the Kitāb al-Kashf, but it is a secondary stage in the history of Shi'ism. When the Shi'ism appears, it is a nebula yes, it's a nebulous of groups that held a large variety of beliefs, and afterwards, when the 12er Shi'is become closer to power through great 12er Shi'i families, then they try to distinguish what can be kept from these original Shi'i beliefs and what was to be set aside.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for a good analysis, I think, of this complicated treatise, different segments, not, I think, really fitting with each other. I have not a question but two brief comments. One is that before Madlung, I think the credit goes to Paul Krauss, who pointed out much earlier, immediately I think after the publication of the Ismaili literature by Ivano, that this belongs to the much earlier pre-Fatimid period and ascribed to Jaʿfar al-Sadiq. That is one point. The second point is that, of course, I think if one reads the good article by Mudarrisi, as he pointed out that 12er Imamism or 12er Shi'ism too progressed by eliminating one by one the ghuluww, so to say, the elements. I think the same thing applies to the Ismailis, and in this specific case might be because there were historical incidences which happened and they have to really respond or to tackle, and so who knows, might be that this was used by anonymous da'is or anonymous authors and try to rectify and get rid of these extremist elements. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your comment.
Thank you very much, Faris. I remember our time together in Beirut.
Yes. Nice to see you again.
Yes, thank you very much, and well done on what you've managed to achieve. I just wanted to ask whether you managed to look at some manuscripts during your annotated translation of the Kitāb al-Kashf.
Yes, I have actually, but the text had been edited twice before my research.
Yeah.
So I felt that the immediate need was not to provide a new edition, but rather than concentrate on the contents of the text, which hadn't been analyzed until
absolutely. So that means that.
But I consulted, yes, I had copies of the two available manuscripts.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Oh. I have missed like half of your presentation, so I might ask questions some off the topic. So basically I was just thinking out loud that this kind of text which says that, you know, ghuluww, they're kind of rejecting ghuluww ideas, but later when you see that this Neoplatonic ideas coming in, like in times of Sijistani or Kirmani, and like presenting like Fatimid ideology, although they have like a good time difference, but then how do you see that Fatimids negotiating at one point, like, you know, these kind of ideas, and then later bringing on some ideas which are not exactly ghuluww, but they are presenting imama or something in a very different way?
But I mean, the case of al-Sijistani, al-Kirmani is very specific, because first philosophy wasn't considered as, by the heresiologist, as ghuluww. It was a school or of thought among others, but it's not considered as ghuluww. But as for al-Sijistani and al-Kirmani, al-Sijistani initially was not, did not hold the Fatimid official ideas about the Imam, and he didn't recognize at the beginning the Imam's legitimacy. Then after he seems to have joined the Fatimid da'wah, but yes, al-Sijistani has some features that can be considered as ghuluww, specifically in his conception of the role of the Qa'im or Mahdi, and he considers that the Mahdi will not bring a new Sharia, so that Sharia will be lifted upon his appearance. So he wrote a lot of pages about this subject, and al-Kirmani later refuted him very harshly because saying that Sharia is somehow relative, or I mean it's not absolute, an absolute rule, and that humans can live without it. So al-Kirmani, who was the official theologian of the Fatimid Caliphate, didn't accept this idea. So I think this is how ghuluww articulate with al-Kirmani. And also, if we speak about al-Kirmani and ghuluww, we have to mention the Druze, who were contemporary of al-Kirmani, and who he tried to refute as well in his work. So it was kind of, the Druze were kind of a resurgence of ghuluww, a neo-ghuluww tendency.
Thank you, Faris. At the beginning of your talk, you spoke about the relationship between these pre-Fatimid Ismaili doctrines in these texts and their relationship to Nusayrī Alawi texts. I wondered if you could elaborate on that, and in what respects do these Nusayrī texts get us back to this first or this second phase of ghuluww that otherwise disappears from more mainstream forms of Shi'ism?
Well, this is actually a very old question in Ismaili studies, because according to heresiologists, so 12 Arshi heresiologists, Ismailism has something to do with the Khattabiyya, which are disciples of Abu al-Khattab, who, as it seems, tried to revolt in Kufa's mosque and was massacred with his partisans in the mosque. And Abu al-Khattab held many ideas that were very, very ghulāt. For example, the idea that religious duty were symbols, were people, individuals. So prayer is the imam. So once you know the imam, you don't need to pray, for example. So, and so this is, I mean, we don't know really if he really held this doctrine, but this is what is ascribed to him. So according to the heresiologists, the Ismailis stem from the Khattabiya school. But the problem is that when we look at Ismaili literature, we find nothing in common between Ismaili thought and those ghulāt beliefs. So we're missing a link between those, or if this heresiologist accounts are correct, we're missing something. And I think the Kitāb al-Kashf is the link, is one of the links missing between those two periods. Otherwise, we don't understand what is the relationship with of Ismailis to the Khattabiya. Yes, exactly. Whereas the Nusayris, on the other hand, considered him as a bab of the sixth Imam. So it is the Nusayris who have generally adopted all the ghulāt beliefs, and this is why we find some parallels between some passages of the Kitāb al-Kashf and the Nusayrī literature, as this Kali that I mentioned. And this Kali, we find this nowhere in Islamic literature, or Ismaili literature, Shia literature. I've never seen that anywhere other than in al-Tabarani's work. So how can this word be present in text that seems to have nothing in common? Well, the thing in common is this Shia ghuluw.
Well, leaving aside the Khattabiya or Abul Khattab, another strange thing I found, and I wrote it, I think, a long time back, that 12 words are in no way different than the Ismailis as far as ghuluw, meaning it's a difference of degree. Again, the question, the theory of imamat and other things, and especially in that particular article, I elaborated about the ilm, the knowledge of Imam, and there you see it that Imam knows all the languages of the world. He can speak this thing, that thing. Even he has, like the red hot line between Washington and the Moscow. If he needs something which cannot be, so to say, inspired, then he can communicate to God and other thing. So it's, I think, the same origin, meaning ghulāt.
Yes.
From you find it elements in the 12 verses as well as the Ismailis.
Yes.
As you go along, then this is more or less either purified or what you call, make it little more rational, I think.
Yeah.
So much.
No, the idea of humanity, leaving the status of humanity and joining that of dogs and pigs, does this have any Indian influences? The idea of
Does this have, sorry?
Indian influences of
well, it's hard to say. This would pose the general question of Indian influence on
incarnation.
yeah, on Shia and Islam in general. But I mean, I'm not sure we can say that. I mean, we don't have. Yes, yeah, yes. No, these ideas were present in Islam, especially that the Quran mentions transformation of human to dogs and pigs. So
It's only in relation to the Jews.
yes, but it's not reincarnation. That's true. It's metamorphosis as a punishment, but it's not reincarnation. But yeah, here the two seem to be. I mean, not in the Kitāb al-Kashf because it rejects this idea, but in the ghulāt doctrine, the two aspects are linked together: the transformation and the reincarnation. But I cannot say. I mean, this is a very, very large question that is larger than Ismailism. I mean.
Thank you so much. I cannot resist the temptation of asking you a last question. As when you have a Mahdi, you have a Qa'im, you have another one. Okay, so the last question, which is that you said something very interesting that part of the aim, if correct me if I got this wrong, part of the aim of this collection of texts is to, you said, soften and refine some ghuluww idea. So my question to you is it that there is something linguistic about, is the text saying, look, these people were very crude in the way they put their beliefs externally, but they have to be interpreted. So in other words, are there rejections completely of ghuluww ideas, or is there a kind of re-understanding of the real meaning of those ideas and the criticism of the ghuluww for having misunderstood something that has?
I think both. It depends on the ideas, on the specific ideas. But the first extract I presented is an explicit and clear rejection of ghuluww. But as I showed at the same time, the ghuluww concepts are still there. So for me, the main explanations for the persistence of these ghuluww concepts is that they are using ancient material, and they are only adapting it. They don't want to write I mean, in the Kitāb al-Kashf, they're not writing something entirely new. They're adapting something that was already there. So they cannot erase everything. They can just, soften the most shocking aspect, or the aspects that they don't want anymore. So specifically, the Mansūr is a very good example of that. The way it is treated, it is dealt with in the collection.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor.
Keep in touch.
Yes, I was very...
Because